Praise the Lord, everyone. This is Elder Adrian Heyman, and this particular session will deal with my ongoing series with the U.S. Constitution, specifically the amendments to the Constitution, and how they relate to the child of God. Now, in some cases, you can see pretty clearly how it would affect the child of God, but in others, not as much. But it's something that we should know, so that if things happen, we're not caught by surprise. The many things that would happen is that when we may talk about it, since this has never happened and this shouldn't happen, and maybe it shouldn't, but someone usually has found a loophole in the law or the loophole in what they perceive the Constitution says or what an amendment says. So we have to be able to understand what an amendment to the Constitution. Of course, it gives it all full rights to be a part of the Constitution. So even though it's an amendment, it means it is part of the Constitution. At the same time, we have to know these things so that we are not saying the wrong things. Not that we should be so involved politically that we forget that we are children of God, but at the same time, we should know how the laws of the land are so we don't run afoul of it. So right now we're on the 12th Amendment. It's a pretty lengthy one. I've broken it up into, first of all, into two sessions. I'm going to try to get through with it tonight, but at the same time, what I'm going to do is go over, it's going to be a little bit lengthy, but it's all going to really lead to the same thing. So I'll go ahead and I'll read it, and I'll try to read it a bit slowly, but in a way that essentially we'll be able to capture the essence of what this is talking about. Okay, this is the 12th Amendment, and we're going to start at this particular point. First of all, let me give you a background. We've already talked about the electors, that when you elect a president and vice president, you don't elect them directly. What you elect are electors, and they're the ones who cast ballots. And those ballots are then counted by the president of the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, of course, essentially, the vice president of the United States is actually the chief counter of the votes by the electors. That's why essentially why there was so much trouble with our 2020 election. It was Vice President Pence who was counting the votes, and he was doing exactly the right thing. Whether people liked it or not, he was doing the right thing. He was counting without being partial to either party. So let's go ahead and start with that. The person having the greatest number of votes for president from the electors shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. Now, understand the way that we do electors. Electors don't usually vote on their own accord. They vote by the wishes of the people who elected them. So if a particular state has been won by a particular candidate, then the electors will go to that particular candidate and will stay with them up until and through the time that they're counted in the House of Representatives. This is what it's talking about. Now, it says, if no person shall have such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those who voted for as president, the House of Representatives may choose immediately by ballot the president. Now, this is very important to know. Because we are in a system whereas at this point only 2 candidates are strong enough to even garner a vote by the electors. So something like this won't happen in the near future. At least it shouldn't happen in the near future. Now, if there was a third party, then most likely, or more, I mean, not most likely, but if there's a third party or more, then you can see a scenario whereas a person can have the greatest number of votes but not have a majority. Now, in Europe, you have all types of parties. Something like this, essentially, in many cases, you would have this thrown in the House of Representatives all the time. But because of our essentially system of government, where we only really have two major parties, the Democrats and Republicans, and they usually garner all of the electoral votes, then you're usually not going to have it thrown into the House of Representatives. However, it has been threatened a few times that and people were ready to maybe disqualify a certain number of votes. And if that's the case, then it is quite possible that if votes are disqualified either legally or illegally, then what you may find is that, okay, this has to be now thrown back into the House of Representatives. Now, if that should happen, this is what takes place. From the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. What? You mean to tell me that the House of Representatives is able to choose? But this is the way it would go. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having one vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states. Sorry about that. And a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. So the idea here is that essentially, even though the House of Representatives can't just choose willy-nilly, they have to take a vote, but they have to take a vote by state, each state having one vote. So they may caucus together, but that whole state, if it's big as California or as small as Montana, it still counts for one vote. One vote. And it must be 2/3 of the representatives present, and a majority of all the states. And if the House of Representatives shall not choose a president whenever the right of choice shall devolve upon them before the 4th day of March, the next following, now it's January the 20th. Now it's January the 6th. Now it's no more March, the 4th day of March. Then the vice president shall act as president, as in case of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. So there you go. So, but in most of what's being said here, it's only if there is if there is no majority of the electors. And again, if this was under a plurality of parties, means 3 or more parties, then maybe we can see that. But in this current system of only 2, there will always be a majority in terms of the electors, even if it's not a majority of the popular vote. So we understand it's not the popular vote, it's electors that determine the presidency. Now, the person having the greatest number of votes as vice president should be the vice president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if no person has a majority then from the two highest, not 3, but 2 highest numbers on the list, the Senate, not the House of Representatives, but the Senate shall choose the vice president. A quorum for the purpose shall consist of 2/3 of the whole number of senators, and a majority of the whole number shall be necessary to a choice. So it's the same thing for vice president, except that it's chosen by the Senate. Now, the way that we have it now, though, is that the vice president and the president are chosen as part of a ticket. So this changes it somewhat. So essentially, if there's a majority for the president, there will, by just common sense, be a majority for the vice president as well. So the same reasons why you probably won't see it being decided in the House of Representatives for the president, because essentially there will always be a majority in a 2-party system of a president. a majority that will be voting for a president. The same thing goes also for vice president as well. Now, there's one last thing that's added to this. But no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. That's pretty big. And the reason why that's big is because essentially we have to understand who's eligible for the office of president. Does the president have anything that deems him or her ineligible to be elected to that office? We thought at one time that if you were convicted of a crime, you couldn't be elected president. Obviously, that's not the case. If you've been impeached in an earlier term, you couldn't be president of the United States. Well, but impeached does not mean that you're convicted. You have to remember the House of Representatives may impeach somebody, but it's the Senate that decides whether one is guilty or innocent. And so far, in every case of impeachment, the offending president has not been found guilty. Whatever you like it or not, that's what it is. But you have to be eligible. One of the things that they were talking about, Barack Obama, is he eligible? Because there's a question of whether he was born in the United States. Is he a naturalized citizen, or is he one that has been a citizen since birth? You have to be a citizen since birth. Of course, he was born president. I mean, he was born in the United States, but essentially there's some questions about that. But in all these things, if you're not eligible to be elected president, you're also not eligible to be elected vice president. So, to make all of this fit into one video, if in the election of a president, the populace elects the electors, who are then elected by whoever wins that particular state. Now, those votes, the electors, of course, depend upon how big the state is. Some have more, some have less. They bring their votes to the House of Representatives, where the president of the House, which happens to be the vice president, well, I'm sorry, he's the vice president of the Senate, but he can also act as also referee of the House of Representatives as well. But his job is only to count, not to vote. In the Senate, the vice president can vote. House of Representatives, he cannot vote. What he can do is officiate as president of the House of Representatives. So because of that, when they count the votes of electors, if there's a majority, the president wins, vice president wins, no problem. If there's not a majority, which, as I said, in a two-party system probably will never be, where it's not a majority. But if it's a plurality of, and let's say it's a third party or fourth party comes and it becomes a pretty substantial party, now it's thrown into the House of Representatives to vote. But they can only vote as one state, one vote per state. So they have to then come together and see how they're going to vote. Of course, there are more small states than big states. And essentially, no matter how big a state is, you only are allowed one vote. So in this case, if you are a party of the small state, you will probably win in that particular scenario. However, and this is a big however, you have to get to that particular point. And you also have to be eligible. And the same eligibility that you have for president is also for vice president. Why is that? Because if something happens to the president, the vice president is next in line. And it'll be a pretty bad thing to have a vice president who's not eligible because of something that took place. This is why the vice presidents qualifications are so very important. So if you're voting for president, look at the vice president as well. Saints, I'm talking to you now. If you vote for a president, make sure the vice president also has views that you feel are conducive to the vote that you have for president. If it's a mixed bag and you vote for someone who is not like the president, but you like the president, and you okay the vice president, and the president should die or somehow, other words, be incapacitated, you might get someone that you don't like, but you okayed his candidacy. So just something to think about. Again, this one was not necessarily, you can say, well, saints can and can't do this or whatever, but this really deals with essentially the electoral process. Learn it so that you don't get blindsided and get mad at someone being elected president, and you felt that we all voted for this person, but the other person's winning. Remember, it's not the populace that elects the president and vice president in this country. It's the Electoral College. And until that itself is amended, it will continue to go forth. Just something to think about. God bless you, saints. Love you all in Jesus' name.